Now we're moving to the macro environment, those larger, mostly uncontrollable forces. We will analyze them systematically. Let me break down each component for you. First, political and legal factors. Political factors include government policy, trade restrictions, and political stability. For example, consider the US-China trade war. This wasn't something individual companies could control, but it fundamentally reshaped global supply chains and forced businesses to rethink their strategies. Consider the massive tariffs, for example, and how companies needed to find ways to deal with these new realities of pricing their products, passing on these costs, or absorbing them. This could affect market share and the attractiveness of the US market for companies. Legal factors include regulations and compliance requirements. The GDPR in Europe completely changed how companies handle customer data. Those who weren't prepared faced massive fines. Economic factors influence purchasing power and consumer spending. Consider inflation, interest rates, and unemployment, for example. For instance, when the European Central Bank raises interest rates, that affects everything from consumer loans to business investments. Another example is the hyperinflation that Venezuela struggled with for a prolonged period. At one point, the IMF estimated that inflation would reach 10 million %. Yes, 10 million %. That is hyperinflation. Basically, the money was not worth the paper it was printed on. As you can see in this image, migrants from Venezuela were making crafts, I guess like origami, from Venezuelan banknotes. At least although the banknotes were worthless, they found new value as origami crafts. One could call this upcycling. Inflation at this level destabilizes a country. Even normal inflation rates put financial pressure on consumers, affecting their purchasing behavior, while companies face rising costs and consumers who spend less liberally. Sociocultural and demographic factors relate to population trends and cultural shifts. For example, many developed countries are experiencing declining birth rates and increasing life expectancy. Not looking at anyone in particular, South Korea. Another aspect of the demographic shift in industrialized nations is the significant increase in single-person households. Naturally, single-person households consume differently, and companies have started to adapt by serving their products in smaller, more suitable portions, or by specifically promoting their products to singles. In China, Singles' Day has become a huge shopping holiday, providing an opportunity for companies to sell more products. Can you guess the date of Singles' Day? I'll give you a few seconds to think. 1, 2, 3. Well, it is November 11th, because yes, this means 4 times a single one. Technological factors. This one is moving fast. Technology is crucial in our day and age, but when assessing technology and its impact, don't get carried away. Remember the hype cycle introduced by Gartner consultant Jackie Fan, also known as the Gartner hype cycle. For example, think about artificial intelligence. These days, large language models are all the rage, and there's a lack of distinction between the different AI technologies. Anything with the label AI gets venture capital. This reminds me of the dot-com boom and bubble. Other current technological developments of interest include blockchain and the Internet of Things. These innovations don't just create new products, they transform entire business models. For example, Kodak's failure to adapt to digital photography is a cautionary tale. Although Kodak monitored their environment, they did not want to respond to the impending changes, or they underestimated them. To be clear, it is not sufficient to possess information. You must also act on it. Of course, in hindsight, it is always easier to see errors, but still, this was an unforced error, given that they had heard the research insights, but they did not listen to them. And finally, environmental or ecological factors such as sustainability, climate change, and resource scarcity are important considerations. For instance, the Panama Canal was impacted by severe drought, and climate change increases the frequency of extreme weather events. If you own a resort close to the ocean, for example, and the difference between your building and the sea level is small, rising sea levels will pose a risk to your investment over time. Consequently, you need to take action. whether it is to move further up the land with your hotel or call the flooded Hotel Atlantis, where people can go to swim. No sunk costs in this lecture. Another option is to diversify and invest in mountain hotels in countries like Austria, which has great mountains. Here's a question to consider. Which factors do you think will be the most important for businesses in the next decade? Remember that when analyzing the macro environment, the goal is to understand its dynamics. This classification only lays the foundation for that understanding. Although one factor may be most relevant in a given situation, factors are often intertwined, creating chain reactions. For example, changes in socio-cultural values regarding sustainability lead to political will for change, resulting in legislation and the development of green technology, which led to technological innovations in that area. Now let's continue with a case study to illustrate the macro factors a little more. Let's pause here and take a look at this beautiful image. This is the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, Austria. A UNESCO World Heritage Site, Schönbrunn receives millions of visitors annually. It includes a museum and is run by a company. Here is a crucial question. How do they market a 300-year-old palace in the 21st century? They must consider the environmental factors we discussed. Economically, exchange rates and the disposable income of international tourists affect them. Socioculturally, they must appeal to changing visitor expectations. People don't just want to see heritage sites and read descriptions, they want experiences. Technologically, they must keep up with the times and invest in online booking systems and an online presence. Concerning the political legal factor, they must comply with heritage preservation laws and accessibility requirements. Environmentally, or in terms of sustainability, they must balance visitor numbers with conservation efforts because visitors wear down heritage sites. This is a good example of how even traditional institutions must navigate a complex marketing environment. What environmental factors do you think pose the biggest challenge for heritage tourism sites like this one? Perhaps you can think of a heritage site in your region to use as a scenario for answering this question. In addition, we will now continue with a brief interactive quiz. Alright, now it's time to put your knowledge to the test. This slide has an interactive scenario classification quiz. The game will present you with different business scenarios, and your job is to correctly classify each one into the appropriate category. One of the macro-environmental factors we discussed. You can see the categories or types for these factors on the left. You will also see the number of available scenarios and your score. You get a point for every correct answer. Take your time with this. Read each scenario carefully and think about which category it truly belongs to. You will receive immediate feedback with explanation, so it's a good learning opportunity. We will do a few together now, and I will make this quiz available online. If so, I will put the link in the description so you can go through all the scenarios yourself if you want. So let's start with the first scenario. That's in Germany. Flight shame movement reduces business travel bookings by 30% as a socio-cultural factor. Let's log that in. Tourism slump reduces disposable income. That's an economic factor. Log that in. And you always get a quick explanation as well. Zero waste lifestyle, that's socio-cultural factor that might influence consumption patterns. "5G expansion enables augmented reality", that's a technological factor. In South Korea, escape the corset movement, that's a socio-cultural factor, might change demand in the beauty and cosmetics industry.